I'm Brad Root, and I'm the president and chairman of the board. I'm a fifth generation Root in the business. Some of you older people will probably remember my father, John Root, was very involved in the beekeeping industry. He grew up truly in the beekeeping industry before we had even really gotten into decorative candles. And he was born right about the time that we were just starting into religious candles. Um, so AI's ancestors came to the United States in between 1635 on the maternal side and 1638 on the paternal side, and settled in the Connecticut area. And for a couple generations, they were there. So those would be my eighth great grandparents. In 1820, AI's grandfather came to Ohio as part of the Connecticut Western Reserve, settled in the Tallmadge area. His father passed away, or the father passed away at about age 45, and Samuel Homer Root, AI's father, ended up staying there until that was when he was about 16, and stayed there, had met a lady in Tallmadge, they got married, and within a year or so, they actually moved to Medina. Their farmhouse was actually just 2 miles away from here, going up the state road here and going about another mile out. And that's where they had their family farm. Had two daughters, a son, and then a fourth child, which was Amos Ives Root. He was born in a log cabin at that time, but they did end up building the house that still sits there. It was a working farm, and AI wasn't as healthy and vibrant as his brother that was a year older than him. So he actually spent a lot more of his time around the farmhouse, in the gardens and helping his mom and things. And this is where he developed his love of reading and gardening and things that would affect the rest of his life. They would come into town and sell their produce on the town square, as we still have farmers markets going on there. And one of the things that they would sell, and AI thought that it was well received, was honey. He says, we got to do more of this. And his dad says, do you know how much hard work that is? And that's with just natural hives that were out there. But as AI continued to grow up, they actually had to move back briefly to the Talmadge or Mogador area where some other siblings were born, to finish out the full seven. But we can tell from marriage records that they came back to Medina, and luckily they did. And continued to be at that house. And AI would go with his brother up on the town square and on Sundays debate Christians. But that changed later in his life as he got more involved in business. But in 1859, he traveled around Ohio teaching people about electricity in his Thunder and Lightning tours. That sort of tragically ended in November of 1859. So he came back to Medina and learned manufacturing jewelry from somebody. And there was already some jewelers on the town square, but he ended up having a prosperous business doing watch repair and manufacturing gold and silver jewelry. And so that started in 1860. 5 years later, the time of the end of the Civil War, a bunch of bees landed on his window. He thought it was just a bunch of clouds coming in or something that was blocking the light. And it was actually bees. And one of his workers was an avid beekeeper at the time. He said, I can get those for you. And he got the queen and got the other bees to go into a box. And he went home. He had paid a day's wages, $1 back at that time. And his wife thought that he was crazy that he ended up buying a box of bugs for $1. But that began his fascination with beekeeping. He traveled to local bookstores. There wasn't public libraries at that time. It was just starting up in Cleveland. But he found a book called The Hive and the Honeybee by Lorenzo Langstroth. And he read that thing probably multiple times, front to back and back to front. And he liked the ideas that he saw, and he began experimenting with it and corresponding with people, and that began his true fascination on beekeeping. Still had a jewelry store up there, but his focus was going in another direction. They kept going along there, but in 1870 there was a devastating fire on the town square, and he ended up rebuilding his building, but soon after that he was looking for somewhere else to keep going when his business would grow. Uh, and his oldest child was born in 1863, and had a daughter right after that. The first one was Ernest Root, E.R. Root, and they had two more daughters, and ultimately, 20 years later, they had their last son, the Huber Root. So there was a 20-year span there, but Ernest was getting involved in the business, went to Oberlin College, and he introduced one of his classmates to his sister. They ended up getting married, and J.T. Calvert and Ernest were the ones that sort of took over the business as AI was getting older. But AI really did grow the business through his catalog and his bee culture. So starting in 1873 was when he published that first bee culture magazine called Gleanings in Bee Culture at that time. And it was a way so that he didn't have to correspond with each individual. It was a way that he could communicate not only his successes, but his failures, the things that he was learning through that process. It's a monthly magazine, and as we're sort of celebrating today, it's still a monthly magazine that we put out. To the thanks of the various editors that we've had through the years. But Ernest was truly one of the earlier editors of the magazine after AI. AI wrote in the magazine throughout his life until he passed away in 1923, a year or so after his wife had passed away. But as I had mentioned earlier, he sort of debated Christians when he was a young child, but the frustrations of trying to run a growing business as it continued to grow was a strain on him, and his mother sort of directed him back to the church. He became very evangelical, and regardless of denomination, donated towards churches and things. And so that had an impact on the rest of his family, Ernest and Huber. Now the business, when we built our first building here in 1878, he was looking to expand his beekeeping. They thought he was doing the jewelry thing, but he was doing the beekeeping. He bought the old county fairgrounds, and that was the first building, and it just kept growing through the late 1800s. But the bulk of the business actually back then was more honey packaging. And we had a line of honey called Airline Honey. It was in the Pullman Railroad cars of the day. We also supplied armies during World War I. And that actually almost put the company out of business by having bought futures in honey. The war ended and everyone wanted to cancel. We continued doing honey packaging until the end of the 1920s. So in 1929, we sold the honey packaging business to Honey and Preserves, and that opened up some floor space. That younger son, 20 years younger than his older brother, but had also gone to Oberlin College and studied chemistry. So he understood beeswax very well. And he was asked by the Catholic Church to look at their candles because there was supposed to be a majority of beeswax. He said, some of them don't have any beeswax, some have a little. And so they asked us to start making candles. So we took that wax sheet that's used in a beehive, and he put a string in it and rolled it up, and that was his first candle. He found that using the smooth rolled sheet before the honeycomb was embossed in it actually made a better candle. It's almost like a transparent sheet of beeswax, and he would roll that wick in it, and that became his candles. And we rolled candles, even large Pascal candles, until probably the late 1940s, when Rolling Stone developed a new process for us for extruding candles. But Huber also developed the first bottled devotion light, taking a hurricane globe and a cork and a string up it and pouring wax in it. He had to change bottles and finally design his own bottle. But that began bottled devotion lights in the church, which is still today used extensively in the Catholic Church. So at the beginning of the 1930s, Huber Root began the religious candle business here, making candles and developing a sales force to sell directly to the church, which is still the same way that we sell today. In the late 1960s, somebody asked us to add fragrance to the votives that we made for the church at our San Antonio facility. And from there, that began us into consumer candles. We developed some other products like filler candles and votives and tapers, and the showroom in the Dallas Merchandise Mart, and that part of the business took off. I mentioned San Antonio. That was a 1918 beekeeping acquisition that got into religious candles with us. We had also, in 1917, acquired another beekeeping business in Council Bluffs, Iowa, who also was involved in making religious candles and the consumer candles. Those locations are now closed. Everything is done here in Medina. But through the various generations, from Amos to Ernest to Huber, and then into the next generation of my grandfather, Alan Root, and then to my father, continued carrying the business on through things like the Depression and up to modern days, continuing to evolve in the business. And I know for my dad, one of his hardest things to do was to let go of manufacturing beekeeping supplies because he was so involved in that beekeeping industry and such. But it was a struggling time, and beekeepers have learned to deal with struggling times. And so we still made wax sheets until about 2000. But our main thing today in beekeeping is Bee Culture Magazine. I also skipped in that chronology was 1877 when they made the first ABC and XYZ of bee culture. And that is now in its 42nd edition, and Kim carried it through about 3 editions. And it's still an important part to us. We believe it's important to our country's civilization to keep the beekeeping industry going and thriving, but they also help us in the candle side of our business. So I thank you for being here today. Looking forward to a wonderful event. Thank you.
I love history, and we're sitting here because of that history.